You'd like to start?
All right. Can we close the? No.
Okay.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to the final presentations of the 2017 Caltech Space Challenge sponsored by Airbus Defence and Space. So my name is Thibaut Talon. I'm one of the chairs of the challenge together with Ilan Agat. So two teams of 16 students named Voyager and Explorer have been working since last Sunday night to design Lunarport, a station on the moon to extract water ice from the permanently shadowed craters and convert it to fuel and oxidizer to resupply spacecraft in space. Throughout the week, the students attended lectures related to the problem statement and were mentored by the speakers, but also by engineers and scientists who came down from JPL each evening.
So the design that they're about to present will be judged by a jury of 12 engineers and scientists sitting right over here. So the teams know where to present to. So the presentations will last about 50 minutes, and they will be followed by questions from the jury and members of the audience. So please hold off on asking questions during their presentation. The whole session is being videotaped and is being streamed live on our YouTube channel, so the back of your heads may be recorded. I hope that's all right. Finally, I will ask you to turn off all your phones and put them in silence mode. Thank you. And with this, we will start the first presentation by Team Explorer.
All right.
We're already off to technical difficulties. We'll do this the real simple way.
Nope. You didn't hear that.
Okay, we've lost our video. That's not a good way to start.
Yeah, I think it's just extended screen with the...
Haha! The miracles of science. All right, we're just going to get started this way right here. It really isn't going to work that way.
Outside at night, gazing at the moon. Never occurred to me that we
Well,
Again,
is there somebody from the tech team who could help us out with this one, maybe? Thanks.
not that we're a bunch of engineers that just constructed them.
So we seem to not be getting the audio through the overhead speakers.
So you need to go into control panel and audio settings and choose the HDMI as the audio out.
Great. Settings, system. You can point me to it if you see where I'm going. You want to take a wheel if you know where you're going? Sure.
There you go.
A lot.
Come on, where's sound set? There it is. Yes, I want to open.
Playback there. Speakers.
You
What's the one that's hooked up to the
look like doesn't look like it has HDMI.
For which? For the. Sorry, what do you mean by dongle? The clicker? Oh yeah, of course.
How do you set it as default? Come on.
As you see here, don't look at me, don't look at me.
Oh. came from? Where'd you go? Where's your PowerPoint?
It's over here. Yep, I got it.
Okay.
Give it a shot now.
Put the presentation.
Yep. Cool. All right.
All right, so we'll start again. This is Team Explore.
Yeah.
Never occurred to me that we would land people there.
Always helps to know your crowd, right? All right. Thank you all for being here. My name is Andrew Kershock, and on behalf of Team Explorer, I just want to say how appreciative we are to have such an amazing group here to hear about what we've spent most of the last week thinking about, talking about, not sleeping about, and really enjoying. So I think where I want to start actually is 1964. Someone who was born in 1964, was about 5 years old in July 1969 when they had their I remember where I was moment with Buzz and Neil. And we here on the Lunar exploitation for extraction for extraterrestrial prospecting mission have one vision. That those people who saw Neil and Buzz land on the moon will be the same people that see the first people on Mars. From the moon to Mars in one lifetime. That's what drives us. And we're going to Mars. It's going to happen. NASA is going to Mars. The international community is going to Mars. The private sector is going to Mars. SpaceX is going to Mars. The question, though, is, I think for most people in the general public, it's going to happen sometime in the 2030s. That's great. JPL will worry about it. But for the rest of us here in the technical community, the question is how. And NASA and the international community, through the Journey to Mars roadmap, have a process through Earth-dependent and proving ground and Earth-independent missions. But I think if we, for everyone who's been following the news lately, between the FY18 budget request, which cuts the asteroid redirect mission, and I'm from DC, so I know that just because a mission starts outside the president's budget, that may not be where it ends. But between that and between actually the press release this week for the Deep Space Gateway, a lot of the technical architecture could be up for consideration. And I hope we can use today and the Caltech Space Challenge as a chance to think about what might the right technical criteria to be and what are the right ways to meet them. I think we on Team Explorer are proud to talk about LEAP as an excellent way to meet those proving ground objectives. The LEAP platform hits a number of proving ground milestones in both transportation, through heavy launch, through deep space navigation, through large cargo, which we'll talk about all these elements throughout the presentation, but also working in space, autonomous operation, in-situ resource utilization. The nice thing about working on the moon is you can test autonomy without having to worry about light delay. You can try it before you buy it. So I want to also, leave with everyone in mind that the LEAP platform has been spec'd to support SLS and Orion to Mars. But to view this platform simply as an element, a puzzle piece in the journey to Mars, misses, I think, the value of the platform. We think it's broadly extensible, and we'll come back to it towards the end of the presentation, but to support a wide range of deep space mission on order of increasing your payload to the outer solar system hundreds X. And also we think this could be the fundamental R&D for the fourth real industry in space. This opportunity for NASA to lay the groundwork for the industry and then continue moving out in the solar system as the economy takes off. So we believe that the next one is going to be called Fuel as a Service, and we look forward to talking to you about our technical implementation plan. So I think with that, I'll turn it over to Sonia to talk about the mission objectives.
So what are the benefits of the Lunarports? Why did you came to this presentation, and why are you interested in such project? So the first answer is exploring deep space through missions to Mars and other destinations, but also open up universe to humanity and learning about the universe. We also identified another benefit, which is building partnership with institutions and also commercial partners. To reach these benefits, what is the dedicated mission? So our mission is to refuel in space for deep exploration. With regard to this mission, we identified several major risks. The first one is the crash rendezvous. So this is a major risk, and to mitigate this one, we propose to implement a safe control mode and to use a robotic arm. We also have a flexible docking mode to offer passive and active docking. Another major risk we identified is the single point of failure. As we will be the only one to deliver fuel in space, we become a key element in the chain to success the mission to Mars. So we identified that it would be very interesting to implement in the future a gas station to mitigate this risk and to make sure that the fuel is available at a certain orbit. Another risk is the failed landing. And for this, we need to improve our algorithm and sensors, and also to build a landing pad. So how to succeed in developing and operating such system? So to develop for success, we need to make sure that such system is desirable, that we will have customers looking for refueling in space, that this is feasible. That's why we studied the last few days on this topic, and also that is profitable. So our target is really to cover these three aspects of design. Next, to construct for success, we propose to use baby steps to make sure that we master all the new technologies that we introduce in our solution. And finally, to operate for success, what is at stake is really to become the gateway for deep space exploration and commercial activities. That is why we need to understand the ecosystem of operations in space and start developing an infrastructure for logistics in space. So what are our options to design such system? Well, we identify different ideas, and so different ideas popped up. First, for the rendezvous, where to meet and refuel for the exploration vehicle. So we identified LEO, GTO, and low lunar orbit. Next, the location of the Lunarport. On which site will we build the infrastructure of the Lunarport? On the north, south, or other craters on the moon? Where to convert the fuel? It can be on the moon, but it could be also in space, an environment that we master very well. So we add these questions. Where to store? as I mentioned before, we could also store fuel in space. And where to power? The ground has a very hazardous environment, and also different conditions that we do not master. So another option was also that we investigated is to provide power in space, from space. Another question we had is, what do we transfer to the vehicle, the exploration vehicle? Is it just fuel, a tank, or the whole propulsion stage? Then the resource we transfer to orbit. Is it the fuel, O2, or is it water, or even regolith? Then I leave the floor to Shane to present our solutions and everything that we decided.
All right. Okay. So here we have a brief concept of operations. What this is called is essentially a bat chart. So as we can see on the bottom, we have Earth and what we plan on sending to the moon and eventually to Mars, which would be on the top of the chart here, and it's like bats hanging upside down in a cave. So this concept of operations is broken down into about 9 steps, starting with the initial launch from Earth to the moon. Afterwards, the lunar resupply shuttles, which will be responsible for refueling the tanks later on, remain in low lunar orbit. After that, they detach from what's going to be sent to the moon that will essentially establish the bases on the moon. So as you see, 3 is the construction and assembly of the bases there. 4, after the construction of the base and we are able to create enough fuel so that we can then begin refueling deep space missions, the lunar resupply shuttles, or LRS, will then descend from low lunar orbit and land on our various launch pads that we have constructed within the base on the moon. So the 5th step will then be refueling those. As we are refueling them, space launch systems sent from Earth, that would be essentially the ferrying system that would send missions to Mars, would go into a rendezvous orbit where we would then have, sorry, there's an update on this, where we would then have the lunar resupply shuttles rendezvous in that orbit, meet and fuel this SLS, the Space Launch System. So after that is refueled and up and running, the SLS is off to Mars. After that happens though, the lunar resupply shuttles, after they have expended all their fuel and transferred it over to the SLSs, they get back right into low lunar orbit and we can continue this transition over and over again, hopefully progressing not 1 but several missions to Mars. So here we have an overall schedule of what the design phase and then going into the launch phase would look like. Don't worry about all these little acronyms. They're essentially just various design reviews that go into progressing the technologies so that they are ready upon when they are needed. So here, as you can see, we have various technologies such as cargo landers, lunar resupply shuttles, in-situ resource utilization devices, and we would start designing them in 2018, and we would progress their technology until they are eventually launched to the moon so that they could begin operating. So as you see here, 2024, 26, 27, and 28 is when we would launch, and everything that's being sent with those would be progressed until that point. So here we have essentially a broad overview of what our launch phase is going to look like. We're going to have 4 launch phases where the first one will be dedicated towards creating the station on the base of the crater that we're going to be landing in. And then the following 3 would be dedicated towards the base within the crater. So as you can see, there's various technologies, rovers, and power storage and communication systems that go along with that. So I referenced the bat chart before. Here's a cute little animated version of that. So we're about to see a bunch of bats flying around in the cave. So here we have phase 1 of our first launch vehicle going to the moon. As you can see, the LRS goes into low lunar orbit, and what it's sending arrives on the moon. Again, the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th phase will be landing our various vehicles and other technologies inside the crater. And then you can see, like I had said before, the lunar resupply shuttles essentially create an assembly line within that low lunar orbit. So once this base is essentially fully operational by about 2028, we are going to have a 26-month window of when that would be able to extract regolith from the moon, process it, convert it to fuel, transferred over to the LRSs, and then have them rendezvous with SLSs and send that to Mars by 2031. So we're looking at a 26-month window of essentially extraction, conversion, resupply, and then resupply again with the SLSs. And so we hope that once we can start missions to Mars by 2031, I think if we have a successful mission to Mars, there's not just going to be one, there's going to be several. I know as soon as there's boots on the ground there, people are probably going to start wondering when's there going to be a Starbucks on Mars. So I think starting in 2031 with a 26-month window to account for the ideal Earth-Mars orbit that would prove the most efficient transportation method, we could have not one mission to Mars in the 2030s, but 5. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Peter, who's going to go into more in depth about the technology.
Hi, so let's look at the ground assets and get into the nitty-gritty of how we're actually getting the fuel. So the first and most important step is to pick a site. And we have selected Cabeus Crater because Cabeus Crater here on the South Pole is the only location where we know that there is water in mineable quantities on the moon. Other locations, such as Shackleton Crater, there's a back and forth in the literature. We're not sure how much water there is. So this vastly decreases our risks by going to Cabeus Crater because we know there are resources there. And the reason we know is because of the L-Cross mission, which happened in 2009. And here we are in Cabeus Crater, right here, where L-Cross landed. And we can see this plume that went up when L-Cross was slammed purposefully into the crater, and we measured water and 4% weight content out of that plume. So now that we know that there's water here, where do we go in Cabeus Crater? And the conditions that we need to meet is there need to be power, water, communications, and flat. It needs to be traversable so that we can actually get the water out. And in order to do that, we've selected this shadowed region. This is where L-Cross landed, right about here. And that's where we're going. We're going near there. That's where the water is. So we've gone with an architecture that I'll tell you more about the pros later. We've gone with an architecture where we have power and communications coming from the rim of the crater. So we're right here, rim of the crater. Here's the mountain. And we've selected a location here for our main post, which is going to be very close to our mining operations, and an auxiliary post, which helps add excess power and helps us in order to have more continuous power and communications. So this is a map of the solar incidence, the average sunlight that we receive over a year. And there's a bright spot and a bright spot, and that's where we want to be. Because we get more sunlight. This gets 78% sunlight over the course of the year. This gets 95% sunlight. And this is, imagine you're in the Arctic Circle, the sun's going around you on the horizon. That's the picture you have. So the interruption is not continuous or on and off for months. It's on and off over a period of time over the 27-hour sidereal cycle of the moon as it orbits. And here, this is a map with Earth line of sight. Up here, again, same location, we get 95% line of sight to the Earth, 95% of the time. Down here, we have 79% line of sight to the Earth. And that's the last thing that we need to consider is, can we actually land at these locations? So this is a slope map, and slope, red's bad, red is steep. White is smooth. White, we want to land there. And this is the location where we want to land. These are slopes of less than 5 degrees up there on the rim, and we have spot sizes of a few hundred square meters where we can land. And Blue Origin has demonstrated technology that can land us with sub-meter accuracy in a location. So these are large enough to land and deploy crater rim stations. So here's a map of what we're going to be doing. Here's our rim assets here. This is our main power. It's close to the mining. Up here, this is our auxiliary power. We lose R squared as we go. So this is not as much power, but it does solve the problem of not having continuous power. Here is where L-Cross impacted. This is 10 kilometers away from where we're mining. So we're very close. We know that there's water there, but we're not too close so that L-Cross blew up our mining site, which would be bad. So here's phase 1. The power station is deployed to the rim, and this happens in 2024. We have this equipment called the pizza delivery truck. It is a powered lander that will deliver rovers. Basically, mirrors on wheels. There's a wheel system we'll be able to deploy to the most favorable position on the rim to install mirrors in these locations. And we've optimized it to send 5 mirrors both to the auxiliary and to the main location on the rim. We've maximized our payload to get those set up there. And on the rim, we have 5 solar panels. We have a communications array, which we'll hear more about later. And we have solar panels up on the rim to power all this. So these mirrors are going to be able to move and shine spotlights into the crater to provide power. They're going to be providing 300 watts per square meter down there. And we have communication line of sight. So in phase 2, after we've put these spotlights up on the rim, we can start to use them. We shine them down in the rim. We can scout out what it looks like in that permanently shadowed region. How bumpy is it? Where's the best place to land? We want to know those things so we don't blow up the spacecraft when we land. And we're going to send a prospector, two prospectors, and 2 constructor robots. And we're going to send them to that landing site. And we're sending our mobile assets so that as the prospector goes around, it can find the best place to find water, but it can move. We're not tied down to one spot so that we haven't put assets in an unfavorable location. So we're moving, and this prospector is already built. It's pretty much off the shelf, ready to go. This is the Lunar prospector. We heard about it in the talk earlier this week. And this is a constructor bot. This is not yet built, but it's fairly simple. It's based off the athlete system. It has a system where we can change different parts. We can put in a robotic arm. We can put in a bulldozer unit. And so it's a multi-purpose tool that we have down there, but it also moves to the best spot to go. Finally, we've decided where we're going to go after we've been prospecting. We found where the water is, and we now begin to send extractors. This is in 2027 and 2028. So this gives us basically a year or two to find where we want to land. So this is plenty of time to figure out where the best place to go. These extractors are produced by Honeybee Robotics. We also heard them talk. They work by drilling into the soil. They heat up the regolith. They sublimate the water. The water goes into a tank, and then they store the water in the tank, and they'll bring them to a permanent unit here, this electrolyzer unit. We'll see the flow chart in a bit of how they are getting all the water to the electrolyzer unit to make the fuel. Down there, we've also installed a solar farm, and we have cryogenic fuel lines so that we can actually get water from the electrolyzer unit to the LRSs. So here's our operations. The overall architecture is a phased autonomous operation. So at the beginning, we're going to go slow. We're going to have a lot of human involvement. We're going to check out the area that we're in, and that's going to allow us to get familiar with the terrain. And slowly, we're going to transfer that to more autonomous operation once we know where the rovers want to go and we can optimize their traverses. And they'll also be installed with a fail-safe mode, so if they get in trouble, they shut down, they call for help, and we help them out. And that's good because we have 95% communication, so nothing's out of commission for too long. We have this contingency for the low-energy operations during blackout. We have about 10% power from that auxiliary station. That keeps everything warm, and when we're on total blackout, we have enough batteries and everything's coated so that it doesn't lose all its heat, which is very good, so nothing dies. And this is the architecture we have planned out for the use of the spotlights. The spotlights shine. You can, if you line them up in a line, you get a 150-meter radius area that you can go to that you can always be in sunlight. You're getting 300 watts per square meter. That's enough to power our operations because we have 10-meter square solar panels on each of these rovers, and they're getting 1 kilowatt, which is enough to fuel all their operations. And so using these 4 mirrors, you can construct any line you want, and you can get to a 150-meter radius circle, which gives us access to 600 times the fuel we need, assuming we're drilling down 1 meter, which is the capability of our rovers, and that we are, there's 4% water content, as Elcross showed us. So the whole flow is to get regolith, water from the regolith, and water from the Honeybee rovers. and then the water is brought to the electrolyzer unit, and this is powered using solar energy and a solar farm that is powered by the light that's shined on it from the mirrors. So how do we get the fuel from the electrolysis unit to the LRS? We have these construction rovers, which have now been converted. They've already done the work. They've built a landing pad. They've deployed beacons so that LRSs can land early on in our construction. And the construction rover now is able to use its arm to help with the hose to get fuel from the tanks in the electrolysis unit into the LRS. And this electrolysis unit is basically one of these LRSs that we've deployed earlier, and we're using the tanks for storage with an electrolysis unit sitting on top. So we have storage built in already. So the architecture pros, the reason we went with this design, solar is scalable. You can put more mirrors on the rim. You can move them all around. It's movable. You can get access to a large area. It does not sublimate the ice. This is a concern. You're shining power into a dark region. Does it boil off all of the water that you want to mine? It does not. It turns out that when we phase by having the spotlights go around in a circle, you get a thermal skin depth of about 10 centimeters, which is not where the water is anyway. The water is down below about 10 centimeters of regolith, and that's where you want to mine. This architecture uses many redundant systems. So we have 12 rovers that are extracting water. Each one of them does about 30 kilograms per day. We're doing 300 kilograms of water per day. It's using existing or near existing technology that's already on the shelf, ready to go, or requires very little development. It's modular, and this means easy maintenance, easy to replace, very easy to scale up our operations. And we considered lasers, nuclear, and microwave as alternative power sources, and all of these have their problems. Lasers, you have a double loss in energy as you convert photons to electric energy and then beam it and then convert it back. Nuclear is expensive. It would take us $15 billion, basically our entire budget, in order to develop the nuclear technology that would be needed to run our operations. It's not feasible with today's technology. And finally, microwave will couple to the regolith, heat up, and you get basically a molten salt lake down there when you're trying to get power. It's not good. Okay. So this is the flow. This is how much we're going to be creating. So here's year 0. Year 0 is 2027. We start mining operations then. A year later, we've delivered 6 more rovers. So, and now we have 12 rovers that are producing fuel at a rate twice what is needed to refuel an SLS. This gives us a hefty margin, especially at the beginning, so we're trying to figure things out. But it also means that later on we have enough to fuel 2 SLSs every time we want to get to Mars on each of these windows of opportunity. And we've estimated the lifetime due to radiation on the photovoltaic cells to be about 15 years, after which point you can scale up and you have better technology and you can do maintenance. And so that's our plan. And clearly we've gotten the water, we've gotten it into fuel, and we get it into space, and we have enough in order to scale up operations and have a successful mission to Mars. So with that, I'll hand that over to Patrick.
Great. Thank you very much. So one of the things that Peter just went over is power, which is pretty much a fundamental resource. And then another fundamental thing in spacecraft is always having communications. So he spoke about the placement of assets at the rim of the crater. So those will be the sort of repeater stations, if you will, for communication to Earth. And so you have 95% line of sight, and you also have 95% sunlight on that region. So compared to like a satellite communication system, you'll have a lot more power margin than you would. So first, let's kind of look at this. So the repeater will be deployed with the rover system and located on the rim, as we said. It'll contain a rotating photovoltaic system to continuously be gathering energy from the sun, be storing that into a bank of batteries for communicating when you might not have sun. And then, of course, this abides by the phased autonomy approach that we were talking about previously, where you start off slow. You start off with a lot of TNC, a lot of telemetry and command to the systems, and then you phase into a more autonomous system as everything gets figured out and tasks become more mundane, if you will. And then going forward, we tried to spec out this communication system. You're going to want contact with this 24/7. You're going to want to be able to talk to this as much as you possibly can. And unfortunately, with deep space network systems, it's really hard to get a couple weeks at a time just to talk to your systems. So we started looking at alternatives in terms of ground station networks to talk to our systems. So I've looked at a bunch of different ground systems from Spaceflight Industries, MDA, and a couple others. And right off the bat, Spaceflight Industries has a lot of specifications that are available online. So you can look at their ground station specifications. So we used the ground station specs to size our communication system at the rim. So using their power, their gains, all that, we spec'd out that you'll need at least 4 kilowatts of transmission power from the rim. And that might seem like a lot, but it's pretty doable when you factor that you'll have 95% sunlight on the photovoltaic cells. And of course, your duty cycle is not 100%. You won't be communicating 100% of the time, but you will be communicating almost every single day. So with that in mind, and as well as the operations in mind, you're going to want high bandwidth. You're going to be wanting high data rates. So sending back images, sending back telemetry from 12 different rovers at a time, as well as other assets like ISRU and like health checks, different things like that. You want a large data rate. So we've included X-band systems for each one of these. So each rover and each asset will have a local X-band transmitter, which can be a COTS component, low power system, as they communicate back to the rim station. So the rim station will basically take that, amplify it using a 4 kilowatt transmitter back to Earth. And so we're supporting 2 megabits per second on this, and we've done a link budget, and it turns green using the specifications that Spaceflight Industries ground station has put on their website. So with Deep Space Network, if you do the cost out, it's about $2 million per month if you have all of it for a month. With Spaceflight Networks, it's $50,000 a month. So it becomes a lot more cheap, and you get pretty much unmitigated access to your systems. So we'll kind of move away from the ground systems now, the ground system architecture, and we'll go into the stuff that's beyond the moon, and we'll be coming back to the moon. So, oh, there we go. There we go. All right, so let's start talking about the Lunar Resupply Shuttle. So this is going to be the shuttle that goes down to the surface, collects fuel, and then goes back to an orbit around Earth to rendezvous with your spacecraft to refuel. So there are many considerations in kind of sizing a vehicle or picking a vehicle like this. So we looked at a bunch of the first requirement, first of all, is having a hydrogen engine, hydrogen and oxygen propellant. Those are the resources we'll be using on the moon, so we'd like to use those to power the spacecraft as well. Effectively, you'll be refueling this system as well as your spacecraft around Earth. So first off, that gives us a couple different options. We could build something from scratch, an entirely new launch vehicle. We could use the Exploration Upper Stage. We could use a Centaur, or we could use the ACE's Advanced Cryogenic Evolved Stage. So first off, designing something from scratch, an entire launch vehicle, takes decades to perfect, something that you really have to get right. So that's going to be kind of prohibitively expensive. And as for the Exploration Upper Stage, that's also, for this situation, prohibitively expensive. It's anywhere between $500 million to $1 billion per system per launch. A Centaur is a pretty good vehicle, pretty well-sized. It's been in use for over 50 years. It's decently affordable for our budget. And ACES, unfortunately, hasn't been kind of designed enough for us to characterize it as a launch vehicle. So moving forward, we use the Centaur. It's within a good mass range. You need the vehicle to be massive enough to carry enough fuel to specific orbits so that you don't refuel so many times, but you can also carry enough fuel. So characterizing this and moving forward, if we pick the Centaur, the single engine system is good enough. But that will require modifications to land this upper stage on the moon. So modifications would include an entire GNC system revamp, including sensors, and then that would basically be revamping all the avionics system. So pumping up the CDH system, you need a flight computer to handle all of that. The power systems to make this vehicle autonomous, you'll need to boost up the power systems, so you'll have to include solar panels so that it can regenerate energy while in lunar orbit. You'll need landing legs for landing on the moon, and then for docking as well as flipping over to land, you'll need an attitude control system with an internal pressurant supply. So these are the modifications you'll have to make to this vehicle. This vehicle has been used, again, for over 50 years. It's highly TRL, but once you make these modifications, you'll have to qualify that system. So you're basically taking a TRL 9 thing and then chopping off a bunch of numbers from that. So then you'll have to qualify that. But the majority of the other systems are very well known. So as long as you can make those modifications well into the system, then it becomes a very easy system to use. So moving forward, this will be the vehicle that we are talking about when we talk about resupplying vehicles. And so next we'll talk about the complications of resupply and holding cryogenic fuels for a long time. And so that will be by our presenter, Andreas.
So working with cryogenic propellants in space is something that we were very worried about at the beginning. We looked into it. It's difficult. You've got to keep the liquid hydrogen much colder than the oxygen, and there's always the risk of boil-off and pressure rising, leading to catastrophic failure. Now, thankfully, when we started looking into it more, we found that actually the preferred vehicle that we were looking at for using our propellant, the Centaur upper stage, ULA has been developing and perfecting this technology for just storing the propellant for a very long time. In fact, there exist many forms of methods like the integrated vehicle fuel system, where you've got using the colder hydrogen to keep the oxygen cool, and with the hydrogen you're boiling off a little bit. You can use cryo coolers. You can also take that extra gas and use it as a propellant to force your fuel down when you're about to start the engines. So the system is very rigorously developed, and in terms of boil-off, when you combine it with multi-layer insulation, you can really get it down to less than 3% per month. Now, in terms of actually transferring cryogenic propellant in orbit, this is a whole new ballgame. But thankfully, the very people that we're looking to contract and help us with this project are also facilitating these new developments. So over here you've got the Cryote experiment, the cryogenic orbital test. Now, what's so great about this is that it's something which is progressing forward because NASA has outlined that being able to control boil-off rates with cryogenic fluids is essential to the development of spaceflight throughout the solar system. Down here in this chart, we've got actually a list of technologies which are fundamentally required to push forward for the ease of transfer. And you can see their current TRLs are quite, they're not all exactly where we want them. But if this project moves forward, and working with United Launch Alliance, you can see near the end, everything is ready to go, it's up to standard, it's qualified, and the only real thing is coming in and making the connection with our transfer vehicle and getting the fuel through. But this is also being worked on. You see here we've got an image of NASA's Restorel for the robotic refueling mission. And this is in various stages of testing on the International Space Station. But the point being is that this technology is on the way. It's going to be ready in the next decade. And you've got transfer rates of up to 150 kilograms per hour proven by simply taking the stage of the Centaur and rotating it. Because in 0G, you don't have any force directing the fuel around. But by creating that centripetal force, it alleviates the issue. And this is technology which has worked. So at this rate of 150 kilograms per hour, could even possibly go up, it takes us about approximately 2 days to transfer 6 metric tons of propellant from our Centaur. So basically, yes, this is all flight. This is moving forward. This is technology which will be readily available. And the autonomous docking, which we're looking at, is something that is regularly done on orbit. You've got the Russian Soyuz. So with that, I'm just going to pass it over to the orbital mechanics of the problem.
Okay, I'm going to briefly discuss the fuel resupply orbit trade-offs. So basically, we want to know where to put the resupply orbit. That's my goal. I'm going to briefly discuss the delta V budget, and then with those results, we're going to run an optimization problem. So first, we consider to put the resupply orbit at LEO, but that is too costly for the LRS to go from the moon to LEO and back. So we discarded that option. Then we considered putting the resupply orbit around the polar orbit on the moon. So the US payload mass to Mars is limited to 38 tons, and we think we can do better. We have additional problems with docking. Since there's no GPS at LLO, we could have autonomy issues. And we will require an additional delta V to lower our perigee and take a TMI to Mars. So we discarded that option as well. The third option is to do the docking at L1 or L2, but we will also have the same docking challenges we have here, and that requires a more complicated three-body problem analysis, so we discarded this option too. So the option, the best option seems to be to put the resupply orbit somewhere in this green ring. So with that, we run we did a bunch of calculations. So we used patched conics, and first we tried to. So the goal of this slide is to get a delta V as a function of the apogee altitude of the resupply orbit. We first tried with the circular orbit, but we found out that that an elliptic resupply orbit is more efficient in terms of delta V. So we are going to keep the perigee fixed at 400 kilometers, at an altitude of 400 kilometers, and we're going to vary the apogee altitude. So the LSR will perform the following maneuvers. So we'll launch from the moon, go to LLO, go to the Earth, then perform another maneuver to get into the resupply orbit, where it will rendezvous and dock. The docking can be done either autonomously or non-autonomously. We can use GPS because we will be docking around LEO altitude, and with IMUs and AVGS we can perform the maneuver autonomously. But it's possible to do it non-autonomously as well. So the output of this analysis will be a delta V curve versus the altitude of apogee. So we did the same thing for the EUS. The analysis is more complicated. So the SLS will inject the EUS into the resupply elliptical orbit, which is, remember that the apogee is our optimization variable. It will rendezvous and docking. Then it will be injected into a high Earth orbit to perform an apotwist maneuver, and then perform the TMI to inject it towards Mars. We are going to need to perform an apotwist maneuver because we want to align the velocity asymptote with the velocity of the Earth. And so we decided to increase the apogee of the resupply orbit to the high Earth orbit in order to reduce the cost of the maneuver, which depends on the velocity at the apogee. So with that, I'm going to hand over the mic to Flora, who's going to talk about the optimization problem.
So I'm briefly going to discuss how we sized our system and decided how many resupply missions we needed to do to support an SLS taking an amount of payload all the way to Mars using a Block 1B upper stage. So what's represented in this blue curve is the maximum amount of payload that mission can bring to a certain altitude of an elliptical orbit, which is in the horizontal axis. So if we can rendezvous in that orbit, that is the maximum of payload that we will ever be able to bring all the way to Mars. So using the orbital mechanics that you just saw, we can calculate our delta V budget required to go to Mars from that altitude, which is represented with a decreasing dashed red line. On the other side, we have our lunar resupply shuttle that needs enough propellant to reach the supply orbit and come back. So we have a limited amount of propellant that we can actually transfer to the SLS. So the intersection between our delta V that is enabled by the resupply shuttle and the one that is required to Mars is the maximum payload that we will ever be able to support. So you can see that with one resupply, the orbit is way too far to the right, so too far from the Earth. And with two resupplies, we have our first intersection. And so just to put some numbers, if we can dock at an altitude of 143,000 kilometers and resupply our SLS, we can bring a maximum amount of 39.6 tons all the way to Mars, which represents a 27 or about 28% increase compared to the baseline, which is if SLS went all the way to Mars without our resupply. So this is the best that we will ever be able to do by docking twice in this altitude, at this altitude. So just a really quick overview of what if we resupplied more times. So if we were able to dock multiple times, you can see the increase in payload that we will be able to bring to Mars because we're rendezvousing at a lower orbit. However, now you have to take into account the added complexity to docking multiple times, the wait time that you have to actually stay in that orbit until all those supply shuttles can reach you, and also the amount of extraction on the moon to be able to supply the propellant. So just a number, the Centaurs have to be supplied with 20 tons of propellant in order to perform this, and for the two-time resupply, they're transferring about 6 tons to the SLS each.
So obviously the first mission of our Lunarport is to send a big payload to Mars. Right, that's what we were primarily looking at. How much payload can we get to Mars at one time? And with our 2 resupplies, comes out to just under 40 tons. But then we started looking at what if we did other things with Lunarport, and it turns out that the farther you're going in terms of delta V, the better your performance is. You may recognize this as from the game Kerbal Space Program. It's a SSTO that someone built, single stage to orbit craft. The reason you only see pictures like this if you look up SSTO is because SSTOs don't exist in real life. They're really difficult to do. That's why we have 2-stage rockets, where you have one booster stage that lifts a fully fueled second stage into orbit, and then that pushes a payload somewhere else, and that turns out to be a lot more efficient. And basically it turns out what we can do with a small mission is essentially have whatever payload the launch vehicle can put into orbit, we can make that a 2-stage vehicle instead of a 1-stage vehicle. And so, for example, assuming a launch from an Atlas 551 model and refueling it into GTO, we didn't do the optimization problem on this one. We didn't have time, but these are rough numbers, but we think they're fairly accurate. We can get a 250% increase in the mass we can send on a direct trans-Saturn injection, and 700% in a direct trans-Pluto injection. If we were doing these missions in real life, we'd use gravity assists, etc. This is just a demonstration of what we can do with Lunarport by essentially making your upper stage a 2-stage rocket instead of one. You get it somewhere, we refuel it, and you have a fully fueled upper stage already most of the way out of Earth's gravity well. You can just do a lot more with what you launch from the Earth and with each launch vehicle. This has obvious applications for exploring the outer solar system. If you can send a much bigger payload to Saturn, maybe you can explore multiple moons. Maybe you can do more science with the a submarine to one of the subsurface oceans. In short, we end up getting a lot bigger missions, bigger science, and better value if we consider things that don't just go to Mars, but maybe go to other places in the solar system also. So this is another benefit of LEAP, that we can go not just to Mars, but also elsewhere. And because we have such small resupply vehicles, it's extremely modular. If you only need 6 tons of fuel, we can supply you with 6 tons of fuel, and we don't waste all the extra coming from the moon with a bigger vehicle. I'll now pass it back to Andrew, and he'll finish the talk.
So we are just about out of time, so I'm going to ask the jury to take their own leap with us and just very quickly let you know what else you can find in our full report. We've got a full cost analysis. The short answer is, with our $1 billion a year, we can keep it under the $1 billion cap. It's about $12 billion to full operational capability. There's an interesting conversation about the economics of when it makes more sense to use Lunarport. We found that if you're only doing this once or twice, direct, and your only question is cost, going directly probably makes sense. But again, that's just one of many, many requirements. Think about the science that you don't get, nor the future mission capability. We've thought a lot about risk. Sonia has a whole number of actual rigorous risk reduction analyses. One of the most interesting risks is, can you mine on the moon? Is that legal? Our short answer is we think so. Please feel free to look through it. There's been some discussion within COPUOS about this, but the U.S. is on a pretty firm international legal standing with its policy position. We'd like to bring the public involved. We've got a really cool way to do it, including student partnerships, which you'll see, but we're digging a lot of holes. Could we put time capsules into those holes? And lastly, if you think it's cool to check out like the ISS cam every day, recognizing we've got some bandwidth limits, fundamentally, what does that do to humanity if you can have a live image of the full Earth disk? That's something for public outreach that we think would be quite an amazing change for humankind. Lastly, and you can catch it right at the very end of the presentation, fuel is something right now, it doesn't make sense. You're going to lose your shirt if you try to go into the space fuel business. But that's going to change. And not only that, especially with everything we talked about with Martian Jovian transfers, deep space robotic missions, rescue. When NASA is doing the Deep Space Gateway, wouldn't it be nice to have a rescue craft close by, or as private sector moves? We've got more options, and we actually think that it's a pretty decent business opportunity, assuming you don't get yourself into a price war with a duopolistic competitor. Lots of ways for the public sector to cooperate with this nascent industry as the LEAP program unfolds. And so we'll thank everyone for their time, and I don't know if we've got any time for questions.
All right.
All right, thank you very much.
So since we started a little bit late, we're going to run a few minutes over. We started at 2:06, so they have till 3:06. So 6 minutes for questions.
All right.
On your chart 37, you state that you will produce the propellant at twice the rate to refuel SLS. 2x needed to refuel SLS. I'm not sure I understand. There's a rate on one part of the equal equation, and there's SLS, which is a fixed quantity. Do you assume one SLS per year, or I mean, there's a time dimension missing in that statement?
Definitely. So the rate means that for every opportunity you have to go to Mars, if you want to refuel one SLS, you have to produce a certain amount of fuel on the moon. And so we're producing fuel at a rate that is twice the rate that you need to refuel one SLS every time you have an opportunity every 26 months to go to Mars.
Or you could refuel 2 SLSs per opportunity.
Yes, yes, you could do 2.
Other questions from the jury?
There were a couple different numbers, both in the report and the presentation, on how much you're producing. I think I saw numbers of 12, 40, and 30 kilograms per rover. Was that just over time it gets better, or what was the number you're producing per rover?
So maybe there's a typo. So there's discussion, I guess, to be very clear. So the level that we have now with Honeybee is you have 2 kilograms per day per drill, and we're assuming that you have 4 drills on each rover, and you have 12 rovers, so you have 48 kilograms per day. Honeybee has plans to get you up to 9 kilograms per drill, per time you drill per day, and so that gets you up to 300 kilograms per day. So those are the numbers.
Thank you. Really nice presentation. I was unclear on one of the staging points of the CONOPS, and that is when these mirrors that will provide power inside the crater are first deployed. There was construction equipment there to position the mirrors. So what powers the construction equipment?
So on the lander, So to power descent, there is a solar panel that folds out, and it provides you 4 kilowatts of power. That's enough to fuel our comlink station. And then during the initial stages, you can run the comlink a little lower because you don't have all this high load of all the rovers saying, "Hey, what do I do? What do I do?" And so you have extra power left over to move the equipment around. You can put batteries on them. They can charge, and then they can go. And then the deployment unit is fully autonomous. So there is a paper by Stoika et al. In 2014. They outline a way that these things will unfold. And so that's how you get them to the rim.
All right, thank you.
Can you go back to the 2 times, 3 times, 4 times resupply slide and the percentages? I forget which slide it was.
Am I going the right way or wrong way?
It had the curves on it.
Okay.
Yeah, somewhere in there.
That one?
Yeah, and on the 27.9% increase, 35.3 and 41.9 increase, and if I look at the 39.66 metric tons, 41.9 and 43.9, I'm not following the percentages and the payload increases. Could you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, so basically once we find this intersection, we know that this is the altitude at which we want to resupply. We know that from the blue curve, that is the maximum payload that SLS could bring up to that altitude. And so that determines the maximum payload that we can bring to Mars. So as we increase our number of resupplies, we can decrease the rendezvous orbit, which allows SLS to bring more payload to that orbit. And every time those percentages are with respect to the baseline, which is SLS taking a maximum payload to Mars with no resupply, which is 31.7 tons, which is actually the bottom right here. So if we are always a positive blue curve compared to the, the 31.7 is way up there. 31.7 is the payload taken to Mars with no resupply.
Okay, thanks.
So, yeah.
I think we have time for one more question.
So the launch resupply spacecraft needs to launch from the surface of the moon, then to transfer to the rendezvous orbit, resupply the SLS, and then fly back to the moon and to land. So what's the percentage of mass could be used for resupplying the SLS, and what is used only for this transfer?
So it's different for these different orbits. The lower we go, the worse the percentage is. For the 2 resupply optimal point, here where we can put 39.6 metric tons on Mars, that's about 6 tons of fuel that each LRS can deliver, and that's out of 20 tons that it was fueled with. So we're ending up with about 30% efficiency of our fuel produced on the moon that goes into the SLS's tanks.
Okay, well, let's thank Team Explorer, and we'll invite up Team Voyager. I just need this.
Keep that. I'll take this.
Yeah.
Cool.
Could they use that?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Team Voyager.
Okay, thank you, Alana. So before we begin, I just want to say thank you to everybody who gave us this chance to spend this week developing this to present to you. We're so excited. Adrenaline is what's keeping me awake right now. My heart's been just pumping for the last hour, especially watching these guys go. So my name is Donald O'Sullivan. I'm a graduate student here at Caltech studying astrophysics. So it's been awesome for me. I got to work with a bunch of other disciplines. And I'm going to give you the high-level overview before passing off to go into the technical detail that I know we're all here for. So I'm going to make my part as quick as possible. So we are Team Voyager, and our nickname for our mission is Ice Rush. Kind of a little play on gold rush, oil, whatever you want to talk about. I'll get to specifically why we came up with that. But I want to walk you through the very high-level overview first of our design. So I want to give you what is Lunarport, why do we care, what are the objectives, what are the constraints, very brief design, and then strategically, does this make sense? In a nutshell, these guys are going to get the detail down. So what is Lunarport? I think at this point, I don't need to re-spell out the details for everybody from the last hour, but it is a refueling station in lunar orbit or in space, it's up to the design decision, to refuel deep space missions and expand our capacity to do so. So why do we care about that at all? So our science and exploration goals need interplanetary transport of large masses. That's where we're at today. As an astronomer, I have a particular bias in this regard, but also for getting boots on Mars, getting deep space human exploration going farther. We are at that stage of human exploration, and it's a really exciting place to be. And our design, quite simply put, will triple the mass that interplanetary missions can carry. And these guys are going to justify that for me. So here's a quick little model of our architecture. We, rather than going with an LRS kind of refueling cycle, what we've done is we've built an orbital depot that can store larger amounts of propellant, so a customer does not have to dock, using that term loosely enough, doesn't have to dock multiple times and risk the potential docking failures, fuel transfer issues. We really wanted to mitigate that risk for the economic feasibility and the business case for this if you wanted somebody to actually use your Lunarport. On the ground here, we have these autonomous mining robots, which we have nicknamed our Spartan miners after Joey Sparta, who's heading up our surfaces team. Here we have our lunar resupply shuttle, and here we have our depot. The shuttle makes its cycles kind of in an independent timescale almost, filling up the depot, and then the depot is ready to refuel somebody with one transfer and one docking. The key focus of this architecture is that we want it to be modular. We don't want to wait. Oh, sorry, what did I do here? There, it came up. So we want to be able to build on this in a very just incremental way, because we don't want to wait until we get to the 650 metric tons you need for the cargo and crew for a Mars mission. We want to be able to fuel and test and get there in incremental technology testing steps. And especially for me, like I said again, I want to see satellites fueled, and I want to see solar system exploration fueled. So what we have here is you can add more miners, we can scale up our storage capacity, scale up our production capacity very easily with the modular architecture that we've developed. So what are our objectives? Our constraints. I guess I've given you our objectives. Our constraints are $1 billion a year of a budget. We need to mine resources at one of the lunar poles, and we need to have autonomous construction and operation. For a quick overview of how we're going to do that, and we'll elaborate on this later, as I said, we're going to have a... Oh, I'm sorry, I pressed the wrong button there. So, as I said, we're going to have our fueling depot here. We're going to have our LRS, which is... Oh, I think it's docked. Yeah, we've got our LRS docked with the fueling depot. Sorry, I forgot when we took this picture. So what we have here is we have our SLS launch. So let's say this is for a Mars mission. We have our SLS launch here. The EUS, the upper stage, comes up to our L1 rendezvous point. We dock, we fuel up. It should take us a matter of days, I think, to fuel up. We'll be pushing some technological innovation to get there. And then they can go off and get on their Mars orbit or deep system orbit, wherever they're going to. So strategically, why are we doing this? It doesn't make sense. Where does it fit in with other people's plans? So two things I want to bring up are, this week, this kind of information came out, which is really exciting. The kind of, at least for me it did, I don't know if somebody knew about it before, but the NASA is looking at the Deep Space Gateway, which will be a temporary habitat in cislunar space for deep space exploration. Our depot would be extremely symbiotic with this, so it's extremely exciting to think about how those might interact. And furthermore, when we're looking at our, one of the big limits when you're doing these kind of things is how many rockets can you get up? Because it's not just, we can send up whatever we want. It's got to be whose rockets can we take, and So we were at an exciting time in that sense. We were watching the Falcon 9 relanding, and we were watching the development of reusable rockets. We've got the Falcon, sorry, I think I might have mixed up the thing here, but we got the Falcon Heavy, and we have the New Glenn from Blue Origin. We have a lot of really exciting development, and that gives us an anticipation to allow us to scale our operations up anticipating into the 2030s where things are going to be. So with that, I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to pass you over to our technical leads. First, we're going to have Sophia, who head up our mining operations. Then we're going to, Nathan was the head of our surface systems. Matt was the head of our space systems. Mercedes and Gary are going to talk about our operations. And to give you some anticipation of the structure, they're going to walk through all of the subsystems in a sense of what are the requirements, design structure, what do we need to get there, and what are the risks, how do we mitigate them. So with that, I'm going to pass off to Sophia.
Thank you. All right, so my name's Sophia. I'm the ISRU team lead, or in-situ resource utilization. And I'm going to be running through our mining operations and development planning. So in terms of how we've structured our development plan, we've based it on the phasing approach of typical mining operations, beginning with an exploration and prospecting stage, which follows into feasibility studies, and from which we can develop our mine planning and construction. This leads into our mine development operation, where we produce the resources that are required, and then towards the end we're looking at end of life and mine closure, and then if we completely develop a resource field, identifying new prospects, and the cycle begins again. So the reason for taking this phased approach is to decrease geological uncertainty, and in turn decrease engineering risk and decrease financial risk. How do we establish our exploration target? We begin first with our business interface. So what are the business goals? And to do that, we need to define what our deposit type is, what we're looking for, define the threshold size and quality that is required, and from that we can translate that to a specific location in terms of geological and geographical location, and also base this on our engineering constraints. So the type of resource, we're looking for water ice of about greater than 4 weight percent, which is able to supply propellant to support cargo and crewed flight missions to Mars by the mid to late 2030s. Our geographical parameters is we're looking for resources in the lunar south pole. Our geological parameters, we're looking in the permanently shadowed regions, or PSRs, which is where we're more likely to find the geological resources that we're requiring. And these are operating in environments that are less than 100 Kelvin, more likely to be around 40 Kelvin, with potential for stable ice close to the surface within the first top 10 centimetres. And this distribution is likely to be governed by small impact cratering, although more geological analysis is required. So our engineering constraints would be that it needs to be located in proximity to where we can land and where we can construct our base, as well as there needs to be a transversal terrain between our base construction and the resources and absence of geohazards for our operations. So our site selection. So we've considered a number of different aspects in determining where our site selection. Obviously, we've chosen the polar regions. We've chosen a site that's located about 100 kilometres in close proximity to Shackleton Crater, within the permanently shadowed region. And in that, we've also considered our light visibility, direct-to-Earth communications, and where we're likely to get resources. So the landing site we've chosen is located here. We get approximately 20 days of sunlight of the 28. Our first prospect region is located quite close. It would be a small resource field, but it allows quick transport between the landing site and the deposit. Our second prospect site would be about a 2 to 3 kilometre distance, and much larger field, but much colder. Prospect C is a much further distance away, and we may not be able to, with our current technology, develop at that kind of distance, but prospecting, if we discover prospectable resources in that area, we could then consider these contingent resources. What I'll go through now is just some of our subsystems and equipment that we'll be using. So as I mentioned, we're beginning with prospecting, and so we're using a lunar resource prospector. And the primary requirement for this is to identify water-rich deposits of greater than 4 weight percent. And the secondary requirements would be to define the composition, water content and extent of the water-rich deposits, to characterise the terrain and environment in terms of slope, identifying the geohazards, and any temperature constraints we may encounter. And we also need to define the accessibility and extractability of the resources, considering geomechanical properties and the depth to the resources. So for that, we'll be using a modification of the Lunar Resource Prospector. We'll be including in it an RTG so that we can operate for a more extensive period in the colder regions, and also including a LiDAR for localization purposes. And we'll be taking a similar approach to the Lunar Resource Prospector in terms of how we will look for our resources, using the neutron spectrometer to firstly identify areas of high concentration of hydrogen, and then the science team would decide where to drill in order to verify the presence of a resource. And then our lunar miners, their primary requirements, so there's a few stages there, and some of our later presenters will go through what each of these stages are. But our first requirement is to be able to produce 19.5 tonnes of water by 2026 for a technical demonstration. We have a second technical demonstration in 2028 where we need to produce 45.2 tonnes of water. Our third requirement would then be to supply 703 tonnes of water by 2032 for our first of 2 cargo missions to Mars, and to produce 175.9 tonnes of water by 2034 for our first crewed mission to Mars. The secondary requirements would then be to continue refueling 2 cargo and 1 crewed mission to Mars every 4 years. So just to go in a bit more detail about our equipment, we've chosen to use for our drill, the Honeybee Robotics PVX Cora, which drills into the subsurface and heats the regolith and captures the volatiles within a storage container within the rover itself, and reduces the need to transport regolith large distances. Our base will be using the Apollo lander roving vehicle, which we've chosen for its carrying capacity as well as its proven technology. And this is just a little demonstrations of, we have 4 drills, 2 on either side, and they'll just move along extracting the resources. So just in terms of the subsurface breakdown, our scouting resource prospector is around a TRL of 5. The analogue is the Lunar Resource Prospector, but we'll be including an RTG and a LiDAR. The miner, the structure is a TRL 9 based on the Apollo lunar roving vehicle, and we've given our drilling and processing unit a TRL of around 6. The basis being that for the Lunar Prospector, a prototype has been built and undergone environmental and stress testing, and we need to integrate the RTG and LiDAR systems. The lunar miners have also had prototypes built and have undergone laboratory testing in analog conditions using lunar simulant of around 6 to 12% saturation level. And future studies would include integrating the Apollo lunar lander as well as our power system, which is a microwave beaming technology. These current tests are based on using an RTG. So we've also, in terms of the prospecting and mining rovers, we've outlined a number of potential risks, nothing in the red area. One of the greatest effects, of course, is our temperature. We're operating in very cold temperatures, but we've instigated a number of mitigation strategies in order for our rovers to be able to cope with that, and Nathan will present a bit more on that. Another one is rover drill bit if it gets stuck in hole or damaged. And to mitigate that risk, we can have the ability to release our drill bit and replace it with a spare. The following ones is just related to faults and how we can manage loss of communication and having pathways in place so that it can go into a safe mode and head back to base, and so we can troubleshoot any problems. And just finally, in terms of a schedule for water production, at first we'll only have 2 mining robots, and production rate will increase as we continue to provide mining rovers to the site. You'll see slight drops in production, and this is where our miners reach an end of life, and then we continue to resupply new mining rovers to the site, and you'll also start to see a drop off in production rate towards the 2050 zone when we stop providing new rovers, and also where the field begins to reach its end of life as well, and we're producing from resources that aren't as prospective as the earlier ones. So with that, I'll hand over to Nathan, who will present on our lunar surface systems architecture.
Thank you. Hi, so I'm going to be talking about our overall architecture on the surface and how we actually came up to this design. We really had to look at a lot of different designs and see what really makes sense. We looked at using laser beams from the orbit to power our systems. We looked at cables, but every one of these things that had a lot of risks, and also RTGs to power our robots, that would have been great, but again, that's something that is not very feasible. So we came up with the best possible solution that we think might make sense, and I'm going to actually present that to you guys. So first off, we'll have our first launch to the moon. We'll include the prospector and our satellites, the four CubeSats that will allow us to actually have a sight of our region at all times, help be able to communicate with Earth. And then once the prospector picks our optimal site, then our next shipment will arrive from Earth, and that is, so we really actually looked into actually the size, volume, mass, and make sure everything we could send can actually fit within the Falcon Heavy launch vehicles. So our second shipment actually has a sintering robot. So this is our construction robot, and within what we're actually taking advantage of is the actual lander itself, using that as a structure to support our solar panels, our communications, and our source of power, which is microwave, which is using microwave beaming. And on each robot and on the lander itself, there is batteries to be able to provide the rovers just for actual traveling without actually doing any work, just in case they get lost or they don't have power from the main source. So the sintering robot, the first thing it does, it goes ahead and builds our landings, our launch pad for the LRS, and it creates a protective wall, just in case of any kind of ejections from the surface. And after that, its next job is to create 2 more smaller landing sites or launch pads for our next 2 rovers, or I'm sorry, for our next 2 landers that will arrive. We're adding beacons here to make sure that we land with a good enough accuracy, especially for this lander over here. It needs to be pretty close to the wall, so we definitely don't want to crash into it. and I'll explain later why that needs to be close. But after this overall construction, the sintering robot has a different purpose, which I will explain again. Now, our next lander would be our miners lander. So it carries the miners, which Sophia talked about. And again, they all get powered the same way, using solar panels and then converting that to radio beaming, and it powers these guys. Again, these guys all have that whole day of enough batteries to be able to climb back to their house over during lunar nights, because we obviously will not have sun at all times. There's going to be about a 7-day darkness that we'll have, and we really try to avoid any kind of moving parts and keep everything as stationary as possible, since these are what is actually powering and producing all of our fuel. Also, we really went for redundancy and in terms of power. So after our next lander arrives, which is this lander actually doesn't carry any vehicles in there. All it does, its main purpose is to do the electrolysis to convert the ice into liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen, and also has a tank to store all three of those. And again, the analysis was done. It will definitely fit for the production rates that we're going for. Through this wall, there will be a cable or a pipe that the sintering robot will actually grab on the other side whenever the LRS the LRS lands for refueling. So that was the purpose of this guy actually being close. So we made sure we have the right cooling system for both our liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, and so we can actually make that happen. I'm gonna move forward a little bit quicker. And also there's the cable, one thing I wanted to mention. For redundancy that I was talking about, these two will be connected with a cable, which there will be a small rover that comes out of each one of them, and they actually go and they meet right in the middle to connect. And this allows for us, in case of any kind of a failure within this system, which is powering these guys down here, then it can always power itself from this station. I'm going to move forward. So with the construction robot that I talked about, the sintering robot has actually has microwave modules underneath to actually create the sintering process, which is going from powder to solid without melting it, and also it has all the attachments that will help building the berm and also constructing the launch pad. And also the secondary purpose was to actually be the connecting structure for the resupply of the launch pad, and that is with a robotic arm that it carries. So our launch pad design, what the design that we're looking at is actually, so the sintering robot comes in, sinters the material, and then what it does, it with the hammer and the drill it has, it actually cracks them down to bigger chunks, and this allows for a porous material underneath, and then on top, over here, you can see the sintering robot goes back and creates a nice hard surface, and this really, what it does, it allows for the exhaust gases to be directed in the direction that we want it, and this is the wall that you guys saw, so this really keeps any debris or lunar dust from flying over to our solar panels and all those important parts. So again, subsystem breakdown, I talked about all these parts. We made sure everything TRL level is at least greater than 6. So I'm kind of running out of time. I'm gonna move forward. Risk assessment, a couple of things with the sintering robot. The automated docking failure, that's when it has to actually pick up the parts for construction. We don't want it to actually carry all those out at all times. So there's a process that it's going through. We wanted to make sure that it doesn't have to carry that weight, and in order for our battery and everything to actually work. So this could be a risk factor if it fails from connecting, and also robotic arm failure, which would be bad, but it's not. And this robotic arm was the purpose of it was to actually connect the fuel interface between our production to the launch pad. I'm going to move forward. Also, power system. I talked about all the power components. RTG. The only RTG component we had was the prospector, and then solar panels, which is powering these guys, cables, as I said, and rover batteries and microwave beaming. Again, all this technology except the microwave beaming is something that was actually looked at by NASA. There's been some demonstrations down on Earth, but nothing on actually space grades that we were able to find. Again, risk assessment is solar power deployment. Since these solar powers have to deploy out of our structures, if that goes wrong, that could be a failure. But again, we have the contingencies within our system that helps the powering from a different lander, and this until we deploy another one. So it's not in the red zone, which is nice. And some of the thermal constraints and controls that we had to do, for example, on the south pole of the moon, we're operating within our region anywhere from 40 to 180 Kelvin, so we had to make sure we have the right heat pumps, have the right insulators, also using thermal straps, and also passive and active thermal control, different coatings. Regolith protection, it's important because the southern part of the moon is the dust. The regolith is a lot more fluffy. There's a high chance of our robots actually getting stuck. So it's important to have less moving parts, as I mentioned, and also having bigger wheels and wider wheels, and making sure we have ribs on our wheels. Also, deployable structures around each one of the landers that protect them from any kind of regolith or small meteorite impacts. That's another thing that we took into account, and the wall that we talked about to stop any of those problems. So radiation, that's definitely a problem. So again, with the regolith covering that we had over our landers, and also the right protections for our electronics, radiation hardened electronics, and electrostatic shielding, we're able to make sure that radiation shouldn't be a problem. And an asteroid, that would be very unfortunate if a big one hits. but for the smaller ones, I think with the protection we have, we should be able to get a good enough cover. I will hand it to Matt now. There you go.
Hi. All right, I'm going to be talking about our space systems architecture. The first piece of that architecture is the Lunar Resupply Shuttle, or LRS. Its purpose is to transfer propellant resources from the lunar surface up to a depot in cislunar space. It needs to be reusable in order to make multiple trips from the surface of the moon to L1. This reusability means that it has to run on hydrogen-oxygen propellant so that it can be refueled from what we're producing already. In order to match the timeline for our other components, we have to get this thing ready to fly in less than 7 years, so we need to rely heavily on existing technologies. Our concept of operations is to start by landing the LRS on the moon. The most important part of this concept of operations is this blue pipeline taking water from the surface of the moon up to our depot in space. That transfer is what the LRS is meant to facilitate. When we're on the moon, we load up with 15 tons of water and 20 tons of propellant from our base. We burn that to get to our depot. We then deposit that water into the depot, where it's converted to 11 tons of propellant. We can then optionally wait at the depot until we're ready for our next refueling cycle, at which point we take half of the propellant we deposited, withdraw it back from the depot, and use it to fly back to the moon to go pick up more water. The other 5.5 tons of propellant remains in the depot, and after we repeat this boxed cycle several times, we build up enough propellant to refuel a customer vehicle on its way to interplanetary flight. The next piece of our concept of operations is our descent and landing operation. We're going to be pushing the reusability on these LRSs very hard, trying to get somewhere between 10 and 15 flights out of them. That means towards the end of life, there's a good chance of failure, and our end of life disposal plan might be accidentally making a crater on the moon. When we do that, we want to make really sure that that crater isn't in the middle of our base, because that would pose a risk to damaging our infrastructure. So when we do our deorbit burn, we actually aim for a place a few hundred meters away from the base. Then, as we come in on that impact trajectory, we use our two navigation solutions. One, a terrain tracking LiDAR, and second, a radar unit, which tracks passive fiducials that have been mounted near our landing pad, to acquire a navigation solution. Once we have a navigation solution, we do a divert burn that very gently floats us over to our landing pad, where we make our final landing burn. And our engine thrust, it can throttle down low enough that our thrust-to-weight ratio is less than 1 during this landing burn. So we don't have to do any exciting hover slam maneuvers. The architecture of our vehicle is centered around its very large propellant tanks, liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. We use a flight-proven RL-10 engine as our main propulsion system and add landing legs and landing radars around the base of our vehicle. Now, once we fit all of this into our launch fairing, we're actually out of room for our water payload. So to fix that, we have a collapsible bladder, which then inflates to carry water once we're in our deployed configuration. This clever packaging lets us fit in a fairly small fairing provided by Falcon Heavy compared to what we could get on SLS. Launching on this commercial vehicle means that we have more launch opportunities and our launches are an order of magnitude cheaper. Here we can see our subsystem breakdowns into our various components and their relative mass, power, and cost demands. Many of our technologies have flight heritage and are at a high TRL. However, several are at a moderate TRL. Those moderate TRL technologies will be the initial focus of our technology development plan. All of our mid-TRL technologies are currently under active development and should be online by the time we need to start building this thing in 2022. This includes precision landing systems such as ALL-HAT, which are being tested at JPL, reaction control thrusters that can run on hydrogen and oxygen, so we don't need to carry a separate RCS propellant, which are being developed by ULA, and water bladders that can survive the rigors of deep space, which are being developed on an SBIR grant at a small company, TransAstra. Given this development, we'll start doing the detailed design of our vehicle and issuing contracts from 2021 to 2023. 2023 to 2025, we'll integrate and test 2 flight vehicles, which will then fly to the moon for a test flight in 2026. From the lessons learned on those vehicles, we'll enter full production in 2028, going into the 2030s. This slide summarizes the risks faced by the LRS vehicle. The most consequential but least likely risk is crashing into our base during landing. As you see, we have a clever landing trajectory to minimize the likelihood of that happening. On the other side of things, we might be overly ambitious in assuming that we can get 10 reuses out of one of these vehicles. However, the consequences of that are fairly minimal. It just means that we have a marginal increase in the production and launch costs required to upkeep our system if our vehicles wear out early. Now I'm going to hand things off to Mercedes, who's going to talk about our operations plan.
Good afternoon, my name is Mercedes, and as my partner said, I'm going to cover the mission design together with my teammate Gary. So I'm going to try to do it pretty brief. These are our requirements. We shall be able to provide a cargo delivery capability of 0.3 tons by 2020, 1.5 2022, 5 tons 2024, and 10 tons on 2030. We shall be able to provide as well 20 tons from Earth to L1 to our halo orbit where our depot station will be waiting for us by 2030. And then we have the constraint of the frequency of opportunity of launches. By we're assuming 1 Falcon Heavy year from 2020 to 2028, 3 Falcon Heavies a year from 2029 to 2050, and then 1 SLS launch opportunity every 2 years from 2022 to 2032. Okay, so this is the general timeline for our mission operations. We can see the phases, the milestones, the main cargo deliveries, and the yearly water production. So starting by our exploring phase, where we'll do our first launch in a Falcon Heavy of our prospector. He'll find the right place to land on the moon, on the South Pole, and then we'll start sending basically the sinter and a miner, and in parallel we'll start sending all the building blocks to build our depot station in L1. So here what we're trying to do is basically the base construction, so we'll keep sending minings, and as well we are trying to build the depot station, so we'll keep sending depot building blocks in each launch opportunity that we can have. So during this base construction, we'll start producing some of our fuel so that we can aim for our next objective, which is the refueling demo. Once we have produced enough fuel to fill one of our LRSs, we'll launch one of our LRSs to the moon. Then from the moon, we will fill up our LRS with enough propellant to go to L1, refuel another LRS, and then come back to the moon. Then our next objective is the depot demo. We'll again we'll refill one of our LRSs. We'll have produced enough fuel to fill it and do a depot demonstration of refueling on our smallest tank of the depot station. And then we're aiming for 2030 for doing our first customer operation. And then after that, this is basically the phase where we're trying to scale up our production rate. And we're aiming for 2040, I think, to start doing our first cargo delivery for Mars exploration. And then I think in 2050, we're aiming to have the availability, the capacity to do a crew mission to Mars exploration. So this, now I'm going to speak about a little bit the operations, the orbital operations that we're doing for each phase of our mission. This is for the prospector delivery. So we will, the Falcon Heavy will give the first kick into a TLI orbit, where we'll jettison our lunar transfer vehicle. And the lunar transfer vehicle has different objectives. One of them is providing the delta V needed to do a mid-course correction burn to get into the inclination for the polar orbit that we need to get to the South Pole. And then the other one is circularizing into an LLO orbit, also deploying our constellation of communication CubeSats with a P-pod deployer, and finally deploying our lunar lander, which has its own capability to provide the power descent towards the moon surface. This is our construction phase. This will be a typical Falcon Heavy launch with 6 miners. The Falcon Heavy will provide us again the first kick into TLI orbit. We'll jettison again our lunar transfer vehicle, which this is pretty similar to the previous phase, but we don't have the constellation deployment. So basically the LTV will do the delta V, the burn for the mid-course correction, and then the circularization of the orbit. And then we'll deploy our several lunar landers that will carry the several minor rovers. Okay, so this is a depot construction phase. In this case, we need to use the SLS because of payload mass requirements. And so the SLS will get us into our first orbit into our first orbit from Earth to L1, and then again we will deploy our LTV that will provide the burn that will insert us in the halo orbit where we have our depot station waiting for us. So, oops, here the animation, I think it's. And basically, once we get the depot, we'll assemble it in our halo orbit. And this is our operational phase, which I think that Donald already showed. This is our customer. It will be launched. He will be launched by an SLS. Then the exploration upper stage will go and insert into our halo orbit and dock with our depot refueling station. And then we will dock, refuel, and proceed to whatever the mission is in that case, if it's Mars exploration crew or cargo. So now I will hand to my friend Gary. He will proceed.
All right, so by the time we reach the mid-2030s, we expect to have reached economy of scale. So now we have everything very streamlined. So we have rovers continuously being supplied to the moon. We have the LRS supplying this depot here in the center. And we came to the result that we got actually a mass benefit for deep space missions, but realized that this was too easy, so we want to add complexity to it. So it turns out that last night we had an epiphany. So we decided, so we added something called a tug-assisted operational phase. So in this case, you launch the SLS into a LEO orbit, and it's completely empty. You have no propellant in it. So how do you get it to the depot then? Well, usually what we do on Earth is we call it an Uber, right? But in space, we're going to call it an SEP tug. So this is an advanced concept that is being decided, that's being considered for many advanced architectures in the 2020s, 2030s for going to deep space. And I'll discuss the SEP tug system in a moment. But basically, the ConOps is that you launch it into LEO, you use the SEP tug to bring it via spiral orbit into a halo orbit here to rendezvous with the depot. And once you rendezvous with the depot, you dock, refuel, and then you depart for Mars or wherever your deep space mission is. So the reason for this will be apparent after I start discussing this. But one thing I wanted to consider was that this sets up infrastructure. By setting up the depot here, you're setting up the infrastructure for collaborating with NASA on their deep space gateway mission. And you have a gas station here in the middle of cislunar space. So think about the possibilities in future when maybe you can pick up Starbucks on your way to the Mars as well, rather than getting Starbucks on Mars. So, sorry, I had to do it. All right, so now we haven't talked about the depot too much, and we don't have too many of the details here, but you can refer to our documentation afterwards. So first, let's talk about why we're using a depot and also why we're doing this at L1. So the first case, as I already said, is we're establishing the infrastructure for a cislunar gas station. That's the purpose of this device. For establishing any infrastructure, any large-scale human presence in space, you need to set up infrastructure. So what this allows you to do is rendezvous for pre-fueling of crewed missions to Mars. And the second thing is we enable this ferry architecture. By doing this at L1, it's much easier to get SCP tug doing a very slow spiral orbit to L1 rather than doing a chemical burn and injecting into a halo orbit. So in this case, we have flexibility. The other thing is that boil-off is a major issue for cryogenics in space. But if you do this on an L1 depot, you can implement system-level, I didn't write it here, but it's zero boil-off mitigation techniques, which has been demonstrated already on Earth. And it's easier to implement it for one large station rather than several LRSs for long-term storage. And because it's so important, I'm going to say this again, we enable ferry architecture, and you can tug from LEO to L1. So now let's talk about the SEP system itself. So this is an advanced concept that's been talked about quite a lot lately. And aside from being one of the coolest things you'll see in space right here, it's also very innovative. So what you get out of this is propellant cost savings from the high fuel efficiency, basically the high ISP compared to chemical propulsion, but you suffer from a very low thrust. So you'll see that you'll have longer mission times, but you'll have a propellant mass savings. So there's a trade study to be done here, which we have done. So what you can use this for, because it takes so long, is non-time critical missions. For example, crewed missions, or satellites, or probes to deep space. I have listed some of the examples there. So how we designed this is we looked at the technology that we had today and current electric propulsion systems, and we extrapolated or scaled it to what we expect by the 2030s. So here we have 3 200 kilowatt magnetically shielded concentric channel Hall thrusters. It's quite a mouthful, but you'll see why we chose this design in a second. And together this requires 600 kilowatts of power. So your solar arrays, size for beginning of life, need to be maybe 700, 800 kilowatts. And we're going to deliver these to LEO in 2 stages via 2 Falcon Heavies, because we estimate that it's about a 76-ton wet mass. So the Falcon Heavy can give you about 53 tons. We're going to split this up into 2 stages and assemble it into this good-looking guy here. So the Hall thruster, each one will have 200 kilowatts. This is a concentric channel Hall thruster, and this is what these numbers are based on. The ISP is 5,000 seconds, thrust 48 newtons, which was calculated from a thrust to weight ratio, thrust to power ratio, total efficiency of 60%, and a lifetime of 50,000 hours, which is about 6 years. And you can replace these thrusters over time so that you can reuse the system. So if we calculated with the system, you can do a 1-year transit from LEO to L1. So a round trip will take you 2 years. And we've taken this into account in our schedule. The amount of trips you can make with 1 tank of propellant is 2.3. So it's just enough to get back and not risk getting stuck somewhere in cislunar space. So you'll refuel this every time you redo this system. So now let's talk about why we wanted to do this, why we had an epiphany yesterday. So our team calculated this chart, which basically tells you the relative payload multiplication factor due to refueling compared to the C3 injection energy. So the C3 is basically a proxy for telling us which interplanetary trajectory we can go on. So we have Mars here, free return trajectory here, Europa, Enceladus, and so on, right? So we want to look at Mars. So let's focus on this line here. And because there's so much going on in this plot, I'm going to let you look at one particular line or curve. So let's look at this blue one right here. As it's labeled, this is the exploration upper stage if it's refueled at L1, and then you perform an Earth and Moon flyby to get to Mars. In this case, you don't use a tug, So the closer you are, well, between this distance here, you'll have to use some of the EUS's propellant in order to reach our depot. So it's not as mass efficient. But what if you didn't have to use your own propellant and you could get tugged all the way there by the Space AAA? Here, this is the line, the dotted line here, that is enabled by using an SCP tug. This goes horizontally over because you're not using any propellant from your own system. So the value here is about 3 times what you would have if you went directly to Mars. So that's a factor of 3. So in this case, we did a quick estimate here, but I'm not going to go through the numbers. And we found out that you can basically be positive with some what we call hand-wavy assumptions. So for more details on these hand-wavy assumptions, please see our paper. But we have concluded that this is an enabling technology, and it has provided a pretty revolutionary mass savings compared to just a traditional rendezvous with shuttle resupplying.
Sorry. No? Okay. So I'm Therese, and I'm going to talk about the business portion of our plan. These weren't supposed to be in here. Oh, okay. So the NASA Transition Authorization Act, as people mentioned before, suggests that the U.S. should use cislunar space as a staging ground to Mars to get there in the 2030s. And we set up our business plan to enable this to happen. And I really love this quote. As Eisenhower was remembered for creating the interstate highway system, Trump will be remembered for creating an interplanetary highway system. So we're taking that as one of our goals for this mission. This is the evolvable Mars architecture that is effectively reflected in the NASA Transition Authorization Act. And then, as we mentioned today, we're talking about the Deep Space Gateway buildup. Sorry, we don't have any pictures. The only ones available were screen grabs. So we've got the Deep Space Gateway in the 2020s being built up. Then they're eventually building up a deep space transport starting in 2027. And trying to get to Mars with this deep space transport by 2032. So we were aiming for a 2032 timeline to refuel the deep space transport system in our business plan. Also, I want to mention that we address a large number of lunar strategic knowledge gaps with our design. They're listed here. I won't go through them because we're a bit short on time. And so the question is, how do we sell this? On the left, you have the development and construction costs. So these are all of the costs for 2017 now when we're starting our building and development until 2022 when we start landing the mining rovers. And as people mentioned before, almost all of our technology is directly analogous to current technology. Most of it's TRL 6 or above. So we think we have fairly accurate cost estimates for development and construction. And this is in millions of dollars. So it's about $4.3 billion to do the development and construction costs. And then to the right, you see on the top our cumulative balance, assuming $1 billion per year of funding. So we gain money for a bit until 2022, until we first start launching, when our money goes down a bit. Kind of flatten out in the late 2020s before we get our first customer. And then by 2032, we're actually going to be refueling Mars missions. And this is our income. We have no projected income until we start the refueling. In 2030, we're expecting to refuel a smaller mission of around 150 metric tons. And then again, by 2032, we expect to be refueling the 2 cargo, 1 crew mission to Mars. And then we're just going to do that in cycles for the length of our operating time. Every 4 years, we'll do 1 small mission, and every 4 years, we'll do 1 Mars mission. And then we did some calculations to find out how much we would have to charge for propellant to just break even during our normal operations. Right now, a metric ton of propellant costs around $10,000. And we're actually aiming per kilogram, propellant costs around $10,000 per kilogram. And we're aiming for, we can do around 5,500 and actually still break even. Gary already mentioned we greatly improved the payload capacity in comparison to just refueling at LEO. So these are these charts again. This one's just looking at the payload capacity in metric tons versus the C3 ejection energy. And we ideally would like to also be able to enable further deep space missions, which still have a massive savings, a massive increase in payload capacity in comparison to either refueling at LEO or just launching on SLS. So we assumed that we were NASA funded with a $1 billion, with a $1 billion business plan, but NASA doesn't really have a for-profit model. So our question was, when should we stop accepting the $1 billion budget? So by 2031, we were completely sustainable and didn't need to ask for the $1 billion anymore. And then we're trying to think, if NASA's not gonna make a profit, what should happen with this? So one option is, because this was a scalable architecture, NASA could just stop scaling whenever they met their own needs for refueling. Maybe they keep it up and they have this excess capacity and they could use this to create an international collaboration. Like ESA has talked about creating a moon village, so maybe we give the moon village some propellant in exchange for using the resources in the moon village. Another option would be maybe NASA has decided they want to enable commercial companies to effectively subsidize commercial companies to explore deep space, and maybe they give them no-cost refueling to enable the US space industry to grow. And obviously, as the industry grows, maybe they would have to start charging a bit, but they could still subsidize the space industry. We could sell our Operation Ice Rush eventually, so that it cost us no money at all. Or we could sell Ice Rush to a commercial company in exchange for future NASA utilization. So we'd have someone else taking over the operations, but if NASA wanted to use it, we'd have some sort of contract where we'd either get a heavy discount or be able to use it for free. The other team mentioned political considerations. I also am not very worried about the political considerations. The Outer Space Treaty is very vague about resource utilization, and the Moon Treaty that tried to define it further and prevent things like commercialization of space failed. And both the United States and Luxembourg have authorized prospecting missions so far, so that seems to set international legal precedent. In terms of planetary protection, we're only Category 2, so we don't have to worry about that too much. Our teams already went through risk, so I'm just going to skip over that. And finally, education and public outreach. So I'm just going to go over 2 of these different programs. I'm sure a lot of you have probably heard of Bodie McBoatface. So and that brought a lot of attention to what probably would have been otherwise an exciting Antarctic British research vessel. So in order to gain some enthusiasm for our mission, we want to create a rover naming campaign. Since we're launching these all of the time, we're going to ask K-12 students to submit names for them, and the top names will be open in an online poll to see what we end up naming all of our rovers. And then the winning school will be able to adopt said rover, or winning schools, since we're launching a lot of rovers. And they'll, so they will get weekly updates on what their rover's doing. As if it's a human, they'll be able to interact with NASA scientists regularly, have a launch party, and just regularly interact with our science team. The other one I wanted to mention was our Mars Trail Citizen Science program. So as we mentioned, we may not know the best way to identify water deposits on the moon, but we can ask the average citizen to help us out with that. So we're going for Mars Trail, a la Oregon Trail, and we're going to ask people to help us identify these future mining areas. And another problem with citizen science is often that people drop out after a little while because there's no incentive. So we're going to gamify our citizen science program. After you review, a certain number of sites, you will earn a virtual structure that you can put in your own architecture to Mars. So we'll have a SimCity-like game where you're constructing your own architecture to get to Mars, and you gradually earn pieces and see if you can create your own Mars architecture. So that's our education and public outreach plan.
So I know we're over time, so I just want to thank my team, thank the organizers all of our mentors, and everybody for being here. So, thank you very much.
All right, so like the other team, we have 6 minutes for questions.
All right.
So I have a question for Matt.
Yeah.
And just to establish, we've never met before, right? I don't want anybody to think there's any favoritism here. So you said that you get, let's see, 15 tons of water up to the depot. From that, you can make 11 tons of propellant, 5.5 that you leave behind, and 5.6 that come home.
Yeah.
Is it 5.6 for the round trip from the lunar surface to the depot?
No,
or
we're also picking up propellant when we're on the surface of the moon, about 20 tons of it.
Okay, so how much does it take to get? How much propellant does it take to get your the 15 tons of water from the lunar surface to the depot?
As I said, 20 tons, which
20.
you pick up from an electrolysis facility that's on our base at the moon.
Okay.
And so the important parameter here for the design of the LRS system is what's called your mass leverage. So this is how many tons of water do I have to mine to get 1 ton of useful propellant at the depot? And with our design, that's about 13%.
Got it. Also, do you have a figure for how much payload the SLS could get to L1?
Yeah, we do have that. The LRS is actually launching on, that's 39 tons.
39.
And the LRS is actually launching on Falcon Heavy, which we're guesstimating can put 15 tons onto a translunar injection orbit. And that's enough to supply the LRS with its 5 tons of dry mass plus 10 tons of propellant to do its landing burn the first time it comes into the moon.
Okay, cool. It's nice to meet you.
Other questions? All right, from the other team.
So I think it's safe to say that we should definitely coerce after this and combine our efforts and make a sales pitch to Starbucks. It sounds like they're going to benefit a lot from both of our projects. But I had a question related to the wall that would essentially act as like a debris deflection. So what exactly is the height, width, size? How long does it take to construct? Is it regolith? Is it like a material you're bringing?
It is. It's built by the centering robot, which has attachments that is 4 feet tall.
4 feet tall.
4 meters tall.
Okay.
And it has a very gradual slope, so the picture wasn't very accurate.
Yeah, it's just kind of. Okay, and so how many, I guess, construction robots are you dedicating to that? Is that just one, and it's just life cycles?
It takes about a year to construct the 3 bases and the wall.
Okay, so President Trump gets an interplanetary space highway and a space wall. Okay, you guys are good. You guys are good.
All right, there's a question down here.
So I might have been confused by this, so let me check. I heard when you were talking about the transferring a 2040 Mars cargo and a 2050 human mission, and then in the budget assumptions it said 2032 and 2034. I might have been confused.
The 2040, 2050 assumption was wrong. That was going off very old numbers. We did a lot of adjustments yesterday to make it physically viable, so sorry about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then another super quick question. Can you say a little bit more about the assembly of the SEP tug in LEO?
Yeah. So for the assembly of that, it's usually pretty modular because you have your solar arrays, which are usually the largest component on your SEP tug, and you have your thrusters, which are attached to a different module. So we'd probably set up like some docking adapter in between these two systems and then just assemble it robotically in orbit. We don't really have a design for this, but I took some of these numbers from a paper by Roger Myers from Aerojet that he wrote in 2011, and he gives many of these values for a 600 kilowatt system.
Oh, there's another.
Hey, it's a really interesting concept, and I'm glad to finally hear your guys' take. It looked like when you were mining, you were getting about, you said 100 kilowatts to each of your mining rovers. I was wondering how you're getting that, because we could only manage to get about 1 kilowatt.
So I'm going to have actually Venetia's answer that question.
Wait, it's being recorded, so we need the mic.
So that's a overestimate. That solar power is to power actually 6 miners. because a lander can host like 6 minor insights, and then since we are beaming microwave, it decreases the efficiency by 50%, so that's why you have to double that.
Okay, thanks.
Wait, hold on. We only have time really for one more question. I want to see if the jury has any other questions that they need to ask before we have more people from the other team. No? All right. Good. Oh, yeah.
Sorry, I can't help myself. How much, this is my total ignorance of this, but how much power does it take to sinter the material, and then how long does that take?
So, I guess we'll go back to...
Yeah, the information that we found, it's 500 watts, and we have 8 modules of 500 watts to be able to sinter that.
Overall construction takes about a year.
I'm not sure about how much we can construct per meter per time, but we estimate that in about a year we should be able to construct the launch pad for multiple LRS missions to the moon.
All right. Well, with that, let's thank this team and also thank the other team. So I think we all saw some really interesting science that happened this week, and I'd also like to thank all of our sponsors that help support all these students coming here to Caltech and staying here and feeding them for this entire week, which is non-trivial. So yeah, thank you to our sponsors. And with that, I think we need to let the jury go and deliberate and choose a winner. So.
Start everything off.